is time for another public speaking video. What do you think of the new theme music? Thoughts about that? Let me know in the Discord. Hello, yeah, hey, look, we're back in the studio, folks. It's nice. Nice to be recording here at the Casa de Professor Yano. I like this kind of Game of Thrones sounding music. It's has the spirit of rhetoric in it, let me tell you. Love it. I hope you guys are doing well. And this is the first of probably several videos where we're going to be looking at David Loy's book, The World is Made of Stories, which I do have right here with me. Ta-da! This is the book. Hopefully you've enjoyed taking a look at it. You've been looking at it. The purpose of these readings is not, to tell you how many paragraphs to have or to tell you, like, how many words your speech needs to be or how to transition. All that stuff is handled through the other documents and through the other parts of the course. So the book is really there to help you, inspire you to think about some topics that you might find to be pretty good or interesting. Or even better, connections to topics that you are interested in. So you might find yourself completely blank. Maybe you're freaking out about a test in another class or something, and you're overwhelmed with discussion board posts or whatever kind of garbage that my colleagues make you do every day or every 2 days. Post a 200-word response to the reading on discussion board. Okay, why? Like, what is that? How does that help you learn anything? It's a task that doesn't allow you to reflect on the reading. So I don't do anything like that. Instead, the reading is there to help you generate the thing I actually want to see. I don't want to read a discussion board post. Who wants to read that? Might be better to do oral responses. I'm starting to think now we could use GoReact and do a little bit of a reading quiz. Because I think, well, you guys watching this don't have to worry about my in-person public speaking class. They're not on the appropriate level, can we say. They just kind of sit there. It's like having an in-person class where everybody's on Zoom class, but they all think they have their cameras off, so they're just doing whatever they want. They're just kind of staring into space or typing on the computer, playing on their phone. It's almost like they think Zoom classroom is the normal, and this is the in-person class is the variant. I don't know. It's pretty bad, but they're not going to watch this video because they don't do anything. But you guys in my online class, in my hybrid class, you guys are probably looking at the book and thinking, well, what's the point of this? Well, let's talk about it a little bit. Let's see. I think I have it here in ebook format. I hope you can read that. We're going to look through it and maybe talk about it for I'm going to do like little half-hour videos about it. So we might do the whole book as we go through. But the importance of this book, the importance of The World is Made of Stories, is the importance of putting narrative first and other kinds of knowledge second. Now, what do I mean by that? What do I mean by narrative first, other kinds of knowledge second? One of the things that's important about this class is you need to learn that people are not convinced and do not change their mind based on data or information alone. They just simply do not do that. What they do change their mind on is compelling stories, tales of the way things are or what someone's motives are. That's a really important word for me as somebody who is, I really like the theories of Kenneth Burke. That's somebody I could make a video about too and add it here to the class. Kenneth Burke believed that one of the ways that we could make a less violent, more, less warlike or more symbolically contained society so that we wouldn't really shoot each other, but symbolically we could have battles about meaning was the role of rhetoric. We could do that. We could do that by showing that motives are ascribed, not discovered. Now, what does that mean? It means that when you think you know what someone's up to, you're putting that there. as a judgment. You're not discovering that from their actions. That is something that, oh, that's the music again. That's something that you've put there based on what you've seen them do or what you've heard about what them do. It's not really true. It's a story, the way that David Loy would talk about it being a story. If everything is a story, that means that the way to engage other people's understanding or truth about the world is through telling a counter story or counter narrative. And I think that's what the power and importance of this book is. And you might be like really interested in that. Now that you've heard about that, you might say, wow, all I need to do is come up with a better, more compelling story and I can change people's minds. Yes, absolutely. You can absolutely do that.
Oh.
That might be you. This is you right now.
Oh. 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 Oh.
Yeah, that's all of you. Well, I mean, I only hit the button like 6 or 7 times, not everybody. There's like 50 of you. God, there's so many of you. It's kind of crazy. How do I even teach this class? How do I do it? Oh yeah, join Discord if you haven't. Little Discord advertisement. Please join Discord and talk to me. I'm so lonely. I'm so lonely, guys. I need friends. Okay, it starts with the Muriel Rukeyser quote. The universe is made of stories, not atoms. He questions that. Not atoms. Of course it's made of atoms. That's one of our most important stories. So already it's kind of a bit of a contradiction. What other stories make our world? Creation myths, folks and fairy tales, 17-syllable Japanese haiku, and 3-day Indonesian shadow puppet dramas. He's a very dramatic writer, David Loy. He's a social activist. He's somebody you might actually want to give a speech about, David Loy. A Buddhist master, teaches the Buddhist religion and philosophy, but he's also an activist and a climate activist as well. Interesting character. He might be a good topic. Here's one thing I want to point out here. A story is an account of something. That's a very simple definition, isn't it? A very good, very simple definition of what a story is. What's the story on these unpaid bills? Ooh. Is anybody else having some allergy problems ever since all that rain? Beautiful sky today on campus, as you can see. Here I am sitting on the Great Lawn. Look at the beautiful blue sky. Actually, I'm in the studio. I'm in the Rhetoric Radio studio. I wonder if I have the Rhetoric Radio drop in. I should use that if I have it somewhere. Do I have it? Rhetoric Radio. See, that's a pretty good little drop in there. I need to put my actual drop in there. That would be actually pretty good. Yeah, too many sounds. I have a very complicated soundboard here. So if a story is an account of something, that's very connected to what I've talked about with the speech, which is that a speech is a case. You're making a case for something. You're making a case for something. I think that's super important way to think about speech, is that you're making something, you're creating something. You're not just discovering it or pointing out research. You're making a case, which is a story about what happened. Why were these bills not paid? Well, let me tell you what happened. It's a story. It sounds kind of simple, but there are other stories about what is justice? What does it mean to have gone to college? What does it mean to be a criminal? Or what does it mean to be reformed? These kind of questions all come out of stories. We have different stories that we tell to account to make accounts of this with each other. This is not to deny or assert there's a world apart from our stories, only that we cannot understand anything without storying it. To understand is to a story. Oh, let me tell you how I know that. And that becomes a story, an account. It's turtles all the way down, stories all the way down. He likes to put these quotes in quite a bit. Any of these quotes could be a good speech topic, you know. The limits of my language are the limits of my world. Ludwig Wittgenstein, famous quote. The limits of my stories are the limits of my world. If you can't tell a story about something, you really can't be in that world. Like the proverbial fish that cannot see the water they swim in, we do not notice the medium we dwell within. Unaware that our stories are stories, we experience them as the world. But we can change the water. When our accounts of the world become different, the world becomes different. Now, I don't know about Ernest Becker's account here of Greek democracy, a little weird. But here's an interesting point. Does this mean we create the world? Now, that is kind of an interesting idea. Is the world something that exists out there and then we create it through our stories? Or is there some kind of reality that pushes back? And the fancy word for pushing back on an account is recalcitrance. So how recalcitrant is the world to our stories? That's kind of the question he's asking. Stories are constructs that can be reconstructed, but they are not free-floating. We need stories that account for climate change and enable us to address it. We cannot simply unstory global warming, although some fossil fuel companies have tried. Now, what he means by that is that you could say the story is incoherent, that it's just a bunch of facts that everybody's gotten wrong, a bunch of misplaced information, bad information. That could be what they're doing. But you have to tell a story of climate change in order to allow us to be a character in it. If you want people to be a character in it and to solve it or to address it in some way, you have to have some kind of a frame for them to be a character. Reality is what doesn't go away when you stop believing in it. In rhetoric, we like to use the term materiality rather than reality because reality is too front-loaded with assumptions, ideological assumptions, I think. So it might be better to think of materiality, which is there are certain things that if you don't believe in it, they won't go away. Oh, I don't really believe that people are poor. Okay, we have a lot of poor people in the world, a lot of suffering people. I don't really believe I need to eat vegetables. No, that's not the story I'm going to tell. Okay, well, you try that and see how your health does. We want to strip away our accounts of the world to get to the bare facts, yet the bare facts is an account. To try to see the world as it really is to enact a story. So when people say, I'm only looking at the facts, I'm only bringing in the things we know, those are stories. The story of science, the story of what a fact is, all of those things. The world is not composed of facts because what counts as a fact is determined by the theory, the story it's related to. So this is a very deep sentence. What it means and what you can talk about is, how did facts come about? How do we know what a fact is? How does a scientist account for a fact? How do they define it? And how does a historian define a fact? How does a sociologist or political scientist or biologist talk about a fact? That would be a very cool thing to talk about. And also it thinks about how do you prove something? So you might think, oh, I can't prove this because it's an opinion. It's something I believe. I can't prove it because there are no facts. But what you can do is you can prove it by telling the story of how you came to understand the world that way. And that becomes the proof. And the facts then are revealed through the frame, the point of view you take in the story will reveal what counts as a fact. What counts as a fact in a discussion about who the best basketball player is currently is very different than what counts as a fact about whether or not you should take a vitamin every day. Narrative is sometimes distinguished from rationality, mythos from logos, yet reason is a storytelling style, a second-order story that needs a story to evaluate. Okay, what does that mean? Well, in order to know if something is reasonable, we have to have a story about what reasonableness looks like. So when you tell your friends, oh man, that person's off their rocker, they're out of their tree, they're insane. How do you know that? Well, because you have a story of sanity. And you know what that looks like, and you can tell that tale. That we cannot get behind our stories is not idealism, which is a philosophical claim that the world is really made up of mind stuff rather than physical stuff. Idealism and materialism, like rationalism, are meta-stories, stories about stories. So the idea of idealism, that the world is all in our head, is a story, and then materialism is that the world is purely physical. That's a story too. So what he's saying is there's really no escape. You can't get away from stories. So if you think stories are light, or you think stories are merely discussions of facts that have come from other places, you're a little bit off. You're a little bit off. It's not going to work well. You have to put the story first. The story is the most important thing. We want to discover the master story, the one true meta story that includes and explains all other stories, but it's turtles all the way up too. The biggest meta stories are mostly religious: God, Brahman, the Tao. Such stories try to point at something that transcends stories. Yet a meta story cannot get outside itself to explain the relationship between stories and that which is outside stories. There's no way out. It's always a story. That doesn't mean it's not true. Doesn't mean we're stupid. That doesn't mean not valuable. It just means our frame of reference for how to access other people and to get them to listen to us and change their mind needs to be based on stories first. That is the foundation of where we start. You guys following me? Does that make sense to you? Is that good? I hope so. If you have questions, do you know where to go? Oh my gosh, what is this? I accidentally hit the wrong button, guys. I almost destroyed us all. Where's the no, that's not it. I think I ruined it, but do you guys know where? Do you guys know where to go for the good look, for the good stuff? You need to go to Discord. I don't have a Discord tab. I think that's part of the problem. If I made one, then you would see it. Haha. Make sure to look at Discord, people. It's very, very important. Okay, advertisement over. A Zen metaphor warns us not to take the finger pointing at the moon for the moon itself, but the moon itself is also not the moon. Oh, interesting. So when someone indicates what you should know, you might think, oh, great, well, I'm doing what they wanted me to do, so I know it now. Or like, I passed the test, so I know physics. That isn't knowledge of physics. That's the finger. That's the pointing at it. To understand physics, you need to have your own test of what that would be. But even that understanding would be a story. It wouldn't be something outside of the narrative. Not speaking may be part of a story, even as the pauses in music are part of the music. Have you ever thought about that? The pauses in the music, the breakdown, the when the record scratch stops everything, that's part of the music. Sound need not break the silence. It can be an expression of the silence. I think that's kind of cool. So there could be moments in the story where one goes silent, moments in your speech where you go silent, and it's powerful. Do stories take place in space and time, or space and time in stories? Newton's objective space and universal time is a story that ordinarily works well enough, but it cannot account for black holes or subatomic particles. Different stories needed for that. Einstein's story. Australian dream time seems strange to us because we distinguish stories from places. For the Aborigines, places are stories, song lines. One of the things, this might make you want to go and look at Australian dream time. What are the Aboriginals? How do they see travel, land, space, time, all those things that make up their lives? How do they see it? To settle a wild place means to create not only houses and farms, but also the stories that make them a home. For Native Australians, their desert's a home because they are verdant with stories. That means they're flush with them. Place stories are essential to non-modern cultures. The more homeless stories of modernity weaken such accounts of the fiction of ownership and property. Today, our most basic story about place. Kind of sad, right? When you look at this quote from Foster about the poetic dimension, about the terrain, and how it could inspire inspiration and escape and create stories around it, myths. And now when we look at land, we just think, what are the taxes on that house? What kind of cool house could I build there? It's kind of sad, right? So, but that's a story too, is that the land has a real estate value, and it's important to have a house to raise a family is a story. All of that. This is a cool word here, palimpsest. Do you know this word? A palimpsest is like a text that you can read under another text. So sometimes you'll come into a classroom and the chalkboard won't be very well erased, probably because I taught in there and I don't really do my due diligence and erase the chalkboard properly. But a palimpsest is a text under another text. It comes from early book culture where they would use animal skins to make the book. They'd use lamb skin. And books were expensive, and they're made out of this animal skin that they would stain with ink, almost like a tattoo. You have your sharp metal point, you put the ink, and you kind of stain the skin. Pretty wild. Kind of a cool way of thinking about what it means to write. But back in those days, it was expensive. So if a book was out of date, they would just wash it. They would just bleach it. And sometimes they didn't do a good job of bleaching it, and you can read the old book on the pages under the new one. It's called a palimpsest. A manuscript on which more than one text has been written with the earlier writing incompletely erased. Like a chalkboard. New Amsterdam, New York, New Jersey, New Orleans. European colonists settled the New World not only by expelling the Indians or native people. They called them Indians. That was their story. We have a new story now. First Peoples, native people. But by restoring the land with old world nostalgia and ambitions. As the white men's guns and diseases decimated the natives, the forests and the soil of the New World became defenseless against imported stories about the profits to be made in skins, timber, and crops. Part of the most restless, rootless story of all, the liquefying power of money that can transform into anything you want. Do you have any friends who are studying what they're studying at university because they're going to make a lot of money? That's a powerful story, the universal adapter of money. Once the power of the place is lost to memory, its myth is unrooted, knowledge of the earth's processes becomes a different kind of knowledge, manipulated and applied by man. So this is the power of a story. You tell a story about a place, like a colonized place, it loses its power as a place of respect, inspiration, and mythical storytelling and bringing the community together. It takes on this new identity of being a place for profit, for development, for creating jobs. Why is that story so important? Why is that job creating story so important? Where did that come from? Was there a time when people talked about something else? You know, we have this campaign going on at the time of this recording, the nascent presidential campaign of 2024. And we have the Republicans are having their primary debates right now, and they're just talking about job creation. I mean, why is that the story that dominates? Is there another story you'd rather hear? Could be a speech topic, right? So this is the point of reading this. It kind of gets you inspired, you know. Do stories alienate us from nature and embed us in it? I think it could do both. Let's see what he says. Being natural is a role in a story. No return to an unstoried nature is possible, since such stories depend upon dissatisfaction with the unnatural alternative, civilization, technology, etc. If there are natural people somewhere, whatever that might mean, they do not know they are natural. What? Well, I think he's saying we understand the natural through the negative, through reasoning through the negative. So we look at civilization and technology, we say, how unnatural, I want to get back to nature. But people who don't have that dichotomy, that split, they can't recognize that they're in nature in that same way. They just say, oh, well, this is my life. It's sort of like a fish. You're like, wow, you know, what's it like to be submerged in all that water? And the fish says, what are you talking about? What do you mean? There's really nothing here. It's because they're used to it. They don't have anything to judge against it. Maybe if they've been caught before and they were reeled up and let go, they might be like, oh my God, that was really weird. I'm glad I'm back home, but that air stuff is really weird, whatever that is. It was too light and it was hard to move through it. The meaning of a story depends on its context. We've talked about that before. I've talked about that before in a couple of lectures about the importance of context and understanding your audience and understanding how to get your audience interested in the speech you want to give. There's so many things to think about with that, but you can't really understand a story without the context of that story. Sometimes you might have heard a story and you don't have the context for it, and you're like, I'm so confused. Kind of like walking in on the middle of a movie or in episode 12 of a 15-episode Netflix show. You might not really know what's going on. Yet that network cannot be understood without understanding the stories that compose it. I'm not trapped within this hermeneutic circle. Hermeneutics is the study of meaning. It comes from the Greek god Hermes, who's the messenger god. Hermeneutics was the study of how do I know I'm getting the right meaning out of this text? And it comes primarily from Protestantism and German studies, where when you eliminate the need for a priest to tell you what the Bible is saying, and you can read it on your own, like the development of the press and the inexpensive nature of how books became less expensive to make with paper and things like that, and native language Bibles, then you could read it yourself. So hermeneutics was like, how do I know I'm actually reading and understanding this the way God wants me to, or is the devil interfering in my interpretation? It's kind of where it came from. But now hermeneutics means the study of meaning. How do I know that I understand this? How do I know that I'm read it correctly and gotten what's right out of it? Hermeneutics goes very deep. So the hermeneutic circle is, I can't understand it unless I understand the other stories, but I can't understand those because I can't understand the stories of those. And you see, you get into this infinite regress. And he says, I'm not trapped within this hermeneutic circle because I am that circle. The life we are thrown into is a storied one where the task of interpretation is unavoidable and always complete. So he says, just chill out. You'll never fully understand anything, but you'll have it enough. And you'll have to interpret, and your interpretation might have to stand in for understanding. A complete understanding and an accurate understanding cannot be gained. Even when words remain the same, their meanings change as we become different. Have you ever read like a book when you were younger and you read it today? You're like, ooh, that's so different. Why did I think it was so deep and intense and powerful? Why did I think that? Kind of weird. That's because you've changed the text. So stable text, unstable medium, time, development. Every other word you read and every word you hear is influencing the meaning of the words past. So you're always in a world of interpretation, even though you might think you have the understanding. You have an interpretation that suffices you for now, but there'll be another one. Another one will come. A story is a point of view. There's no perspectiveless perspective. Oh, we can't have a purely neutral perspective. I think a lot of you might think objectivity means neutrality. It doesn't. Objectivity means that you're aware that there are so many perspectives on an event or a fact or an incident that you cannot be neutral. That whatever perspective you take is going to come with it a particular angle or a particular bias. So the only solution for that is try to bring in as many good, diverse points of view as possible to check that back. I think that's really the only way to handle it. There's no way to escape perspectives except by multiplying them. Exactly what I just said. Thank you, David Loy. A good history of America will include the viewpoints of Native Americans, African Americans, Asian Americans, and Hispanics, and the beaver, the buffalo, the passenger pigeon. Could we include animals' perspectives, or is that like a little presumptuous? How do we tell the story of the buffalo? The history of America told by Jimmy the Buffalo. Chapter 1. I love to eat grass. The wilder, the better. I don't know. Maybe you could write that book, or maybe you could give that speech. I don't know. The stories that make sense of the world or part of the world is not by transcending this world that we are transformed, but by storing it in a new way. So a lot of people would say, like, I am so above politics, it's beneath me. I'm beneath all this capitalistic bull crap and oppression. I've transcended all that. I live in my own space. Oh, people are so stupid. Okay, that's a very bad story because it takes you out of interacting with the people who you might want to interact with to make a better world for people. If you story it differently, if you say, look, this story of working hard in a job is one that was hoisted on you by factory owners and wealthy people because it's a story that enriches them. It doesn't benefit you. The benefits that you understand from the story are coming from them. What would be an economic system that would benefit everyone? What would that look like? Let me tell you the story of the kind of world I would want to live in, where I don't have to wake up at 6 a.m. to drive 2 hours to go to a job that pays me very little money and I have to pay to park there. And I don't get to go to my kids' concert or have lunch with my grandmother or whatever, right? The metaphorical nature of religious language makes its truth claims the most difficult to evaluate because we cannot agree on what criteria to use. So he's talking about religious disagreements. We don't know how to parse that because we all have different criteria in our religious beliefs. Myth avoids this problem by being meaningful in a different way. Religious doctrine, like other ideologies, involve propositional claims to be accepted. Myths provide stories to interact with. So the difference between a propositional claim is, I have this evidence, you should do this. But a myth tells a story with characters that you can resonate with and you might want to be like. You might say, wow, I really want to be like that character, even though they're flawed in these ways. I really like this character. I'm going to try to be more like that character. In fact, Christianity has some of this in it, right? Christianity is like, I want to be Christ-like. I want to be as like Jesus Christ as I can be. So that's why the Bible's written in stories, because it's a map of what would Jesus do. Do you remember WWJD? People had these bracelets all the time with that on that back in the day. It's kind of like that's the power of the narrative. It's not a bunch of propositions. In fact, in the New Testament, Jesus rejected the propositional way of being. He took the Hammurabic Code down. He was like, oh, this is terrible. This isn't the proposition. You should act within the context. If someone hits you, turn the other cheek. And if you haven't done anything wrong, then you can stone somebody, all that stuff. I mean, I'm not a religion person or professor, but it comes up a lot in this book because David Loy is very religious. He's Buddhist, right? So it's going to come through. That's his story. It's going to come through in his book as well. Myths provide personal identity, ground our sense of community, undergird our moral values, and point to the inscrutable mystery of creation. Whatever stories you believe that do this for you are myths. What's the myth? What is a myth that most Americans should believe? What's a myth you believe and you think is very valuable? Did Genesis begin as tale told by elders on a campfire? If this is true, or if we want to pretend like that's true, what tales are you telling late at night around the glow of your laptop screen in your dorm room? What tales are being told? Are those going to be the myths of the future? If you're interested in this, I recommend reading a script for a play called Mr. Burns, a post-electric play. And it shows that after a giant disaster and the end of civilization, people are they're telling the stories of Simpsons episodes they remember fondly to children. And then it goes hundreds of years in the future and hundreds of years in the future where these stories have become the new myth. Powerful to think about something like that being the root of religious belief and moral posturing. Wild to think about, isn't it? One of the most dangerous myths is the myth of a life without myth, the story of a realist who has freed himself from that nonsense. Liberation from myth, is that our myth? Good question, David Loy. We think of figures like Neil deGrasse Tyson and figures like Bill Nye, who say that mythological thinking or thinking without verifiable empirical evidence is to be stupid. Is that a story that allows for liberation, freedom, and creativity? Now, it might be a very important story of why we need to make sure we have good information about human health or what we should eat. Nutritionists have that information. But the story inspires us of who we can be and what we can do differently. So we need that mythological content to be able to create new kinds of ways of knowing and new kinds of ways of being. We don't just want to live in that kind of drab existence where we're prisoners of facts. We want to also be able to have figures who, although flawed, we can look at and admire them. I think there's so many good Netflix shows and anime and all kinds of things that have figures that you admire, but they have pretty bad flaws. But you can tell a story about how to get around those flaws and say, this is why this person is so cool and important to me. Paul Tillich. Now, Paul Tillich is a very famous person. He's a theologian, and you looked at something that rhetoricians look at too, which is the notion of kairos. Kairos is, let me see, I need to write that down for you because that's kind of a crazy word. Let me pop open the old Microsoft Word here. We'll get to typing. We'll put David Loy away for now. Okay, so kairos. There it is. Kairos is the Greek word. It means opportunity, but Paul Tillich took kairos in a whole different direction. He talked about it as moments of of eternity that you could see within temporality. That is, it's hard to think about eternity, like in the Christian story. It's hard to think of what eternal life would look like, or what eternal bottomless forgiveness or eternal grace would look like. But Tillich argues that we can see evidence of this by seeing the eternal punctuate into the temporal. That's his famous line. The eternal punctuating into the temporal. That is, in everyday life, we can see little hints of an eternal grace, an eternal love, a boundless life in all forms, kind of like a Spinozian kind of, well, he's not really Spinozian, but it's kind of like a Spinozian kind of sensibility. Kairos. So Paul Tillich here. Okay, you can see the book. Why can't I? Okay, here it is. So, unbroken myth, understood to be literally true, like this is the history of the world. From broken myth, no longer accepted as historically true, but believed to have deep significance. In place of broken myth, Richard always suggests breaking open a myth. If we want to taste its fruit, we need to crack the shell and chew on it. So think about Marvel movies. Like, Marvel movies are a form of entertainment. We all know they're not true, but sometimes we wish they were true. We wish they were heroes like this. Okay, cracking that open, what does that say about that myth? What does the myth of like Captain America or Thor do for us? What does it help us to imagine or see ourselves doing or see what's possible in terms of our actions or beliefs? I think that's a very cool thing. This is a cool quote from Henry Corbin. One does not refute symbols, one deciphers them. So anytime you're saying that's not what a symbol means, you're actually reinterpreting it. You're not giving reality. Once again, you're stuck in a story. It's kind of cool. What's sometimes called scientism, this is the belief that science is like not just one story, but the story that unravels every other story, and it's the truth. It's fundamentalist because it assumes that only one kind of story is important, and the truth of such stories must be objective. In this case, verifiable for physical examination and subject to predictive causality. That sounds like science to me. Religious and scientific fundamentalism both presuppose that all truth involves simple correspondence between a propositional claim and observable occurrence. Another way to evaluate a story is by its consequences when we live according to it. The most important criterion for Buddhism is whether a story promotes awakening. You become awakened. You understand the truth of birth and death and suffering in the Buddhist story. Propositional content is not a compelling story. Here's the truth, you have to follow it. Why? What's my role here? I'm diminished. I'm no longer a character. I don't have any agency. I can't be anything. Kind of crazy, right? Is the universe meaningful or meaningless? Our stories make us meaning-creating beings. I really like that. How would you define humanity? Meaning-creating beings. That's kind of cool. Like if we don't like the way something is, we tell a different story about it and we create another meaning. And then we all start acting on it. Oh yeah, better story. A story that is interpreted for me still needs to be interpreted by me. No one can really tell you what the story means. You have to do something with it. You have to tell it for yourself, even if someone's directing you on it. The unconscious does not distinguish between true and untrue stories. It's always stories that have an effect on us, that have an impact. Those are the ones we really, really like. I grow up by internalizing some of the stories society provides. They create me, and I reinforce them by acting in ways that validate them. Stories teach me what it means to be a boy or girl, father or son, Caucasian or Hispanic. This one right here, boy or girl, it's really controversial now because people don't like to think of this as a story. The story of gender. People like to think of that as an assigned at birth trait. People get really angry at the alternatives to that story, primarily because they don't think of it as a story. They think of it as propositional truth and that you're going against nature if you don't accept correspondence between sex and gender. This is important he said that there, I think. I don't know if that's what he's getting at, but it's definitely there. Caucasian or Hispanic, American or Chinese, Christian or Buddhist, the importance of or not of school and church, the importance rarely not of money, including the best ways to get it and spend it. We accept the world we story together as the way things are. We accept it as a reality. Yet the stories we take for granted are not the only ones possible or the best possible. A discomforting realization easier to evade when society is homogenous and we are not exposed to different lifestyles, worldviews, and cultural values. So what he's saying is it makes people nervous to see that life, the way that people think is true and meaningful, is a story, and that it could be untold and retold, and it would still have the same persuasive effect. It frightens people, primarily because they don't accept that reality is composed of stories, that we tell each other what things are. Oh, we're almost to the end of the chapter. Then I'll probably stop this video and make video number 2. Stories justify social distinctions. Medieval kings ruled by divine right. A Rig Veda myth about the various parts of Brahma's body rationalizes the Hindu caste system. We challenge a social arrangement by questioning the story that validates it. When people stop believing the stories that justify the social order, it begins to change. Think about Black Lives Matter and all cops are bad. That's a real challenge of the narrative of the social order. And it's really changed the policies about police funding. It's changed the way we look at the stories of non-white people when they encounter the police. It's made big policy is body cameras. Lots of police have to wear body cameras now. The social order begins to change based on the stories that we hear and the stories that we change. The dominant story of modernity has been progress. That means that we're always getting better and improving things as we move through the modern world. Although still hardwired into our institutions, that story has lost most of its plausibility. New genres are taking its place: apocalypse and nihilism. Wow. Apocalypse meaning the world is already over. There's nothing we can do. Like people who say climate change is here, we've lost, and everything's going to burn. And nihilism, it doesn't really matter what we do anyway because we're really kind of powerless in the face of the forces of capitalism and the environment and things like that. Apocalypse is the imminent triumphant conclusion of our most cherished stories. Nihilism is their collapse. Both stories are about the end of stories. That's how he sees it. I think it's kind of interesting. Nihilism inverts progress narratives, liberating the shadow that haunted them. Okay, what does that mean? Nihilism is like, oh yeah, things don't really mean anything. It's all kind of empty. So it kind of destroys the progress narrative. It says, oh, we kind of imagine that that's happening, but really nothing is really happening. Losing hope in the future makes us more vulnerable to distractions and addictions of the present. So it's like, it really doesn't matter if I go to that protest march. I'm just going to play Call of Duty. Who cares? It doesn't matter if I vote. Who cares? It's not going to make any difference. We've lost. The world is ending. Yet this moment might be appreciated differently if we're not accustomed to sacrifice it to the future. So nihilism and apocalyptic narratives sacrifice the present moment to the future instead of saying, what can I do now to make a better world now? Which is kind of what he's talking about. That's his important story. If the world is made of stories, are its problems a result of being enthralled to, that means you're kind of hypnotized by, or like a vampire's thrall, I'll follow you and protect you to the end. Pernicious stories. Do violent television shows increase crime and domestic abuse? I don't know what the research says about that. Advertising teaches us that consumerism is the way to become happy. Yeah, buy something, you'll feel happier. Religious teachings can inspire institutional dogma, crusades, heresy trials, and spiritual quests. There's always a little bit of the dialectic in Loy. I kind of like that. Because he goes negative, 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 but then there's a kernel of the positive in that negativity as well. Is the solution to such problems improved stories, getting rid of stories, or a better understanding of story? We are between stories. Perhaps not a bad place to be. A storied life. A story life. Alistair McIntyre is somebody who I think he quotes a lot. And other people who talk about narrative quote him a lot as well, because he's interested in the story of virtue in a world where we've lost most of our access to the texts that teach virtue. Alistair McIntyre is a great, pretty well-known, powerful 20th century philosopher. I am made of stories. Actually, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to 25% for each one of these, and so you can watch and get 25% of the book in each video, and then that'll be it. So there'll be 4 videos for the David Loy book. I'm saying it now.
Oh.
That's the rule. That's 4 videos for David Loy. Okay. Stories give my life the plot that endows it with meaning. I'm in college because I want to be an attorney, because I've always wanted to be an attorney, because I argue with my parents, my grandpa, whatever your story is, that's like why you're here now, is the result of a story. Think about it. You've told a story about your life with the help of some co-writers, your parents, your loved ones, your friends. I grew up modeling myself and others who embody meaningful stories. Meaningful. Look at that. He split it. Meaningful. Meaningful, meaningful. Full of meaning. My character is constructed by the roles I play. Although I play different roles in different narratives, a son, a father, mother, cousin, brother, boyfriend, girlfriend, a few become my habitual stance in the world. What's a gender-neutral boyfriend, girlfriend? Is it partner? What do people say? No idea. I would think partner, but then that makes it sound like you're like have been teamed up in science class. So I don't know. In debate, you have your debate partner. So we have debate partner and then my partner. So in the debate world, they have a solution for that, but I don't know what it would be outside of that. Boyfriend, girlfriend, friend, romantic friend. Maybe a romantic friend. That might be kind of interesting. This is my romantic friend. It becomes difficult to alter my part in these stories. Like a car racing around a dirt track, the ruts deepen. So as you start to prefer certain roles, you start to dig into those roles, and that makes it harder to play other roles because you think, well, no, this is who I actually am. That's just something somebody wants me to be. You don't think of them as equivalent stories at all. You don't think of them as equivalent as another part of the story, another role to play. When Jean Genet was caught pilfering as a boy, he's told, "You're a thief." According to Sartre's biography, that label taught Genet who he was. It provided him with the story he learned to enact. He's like, I'm a thief. That's my root. That's who I am. So this is why people say it's important to talk to children not so harshly, because they'll internalize it, and that story might become a powerful way that they dig themselves in like the rut and say, well, this is who I am. So every other story that comes their way has to be told in relation to that foundational story, which is not good, bro. Not good. Our joys and sorrows, laughter and tears, pleasures and pains, loves and fears, epiphanies and despairs are all storied. They're all meaningful within the context of a narrative. So think about in terms of rhetoric, you think about eulogies, funeral orations, as they called them in the ancient world. Why are we here? Why are we all here? Why do we all feel this loss? What did we lose? Who did we lose? And why was their life so meaningful? And why are we sad they're gone? And what are we going to do now? How are we going to remember them? All stories, right? When I'm depressed, I look for a story that makes sense of it, even if only a biochemical imbalance in the brain. And that one might be convincing. There might be other reasons to feel down too, and they might be legitimate. They might be part of a story that you could tell a different story about and make things better. To be a person requires more than self-awareness. It involves some understanding of how I became who I am and where I'm going. Both are narrative. How did I grow up? Who am I? What do I stand for? What did my family teach? What did my father, mother, cousin, uncle, grandfather always teach me? Grandmother always teach me? That's who I am today. And that's why I am doing this. It's because of the impact those stories had on me. This is one of my favorite Walt Whitman quotes. Shout out to Ken Johnson, who I used to work with up at the University of Rochester, who loved this quote as well. We used to use that as a debate argument all the time. Very funny. Kind of funny. Well, that comes up there. So contradiction is one of these things where people are like, oh, you've contradicted yourself. Okay, if I'm a number of different stories all happening at once, it depends on the context whether I'm contradicting myself or not. And also, how boring would it be to be a non-contradictory person, to not like say, oh, I hate commercially produced stuff and then love Taylor Swift music. I mean, that's kind of who we are, right? Oh, man, this stuff is so cheesy, but then you kind of secretly like the cheese, you know? Mm-hmm. If one's personality is composed of sub-personalities, each is composed of multiple narratives. Sometimes they work together well, sometimes not, is what used to be called multiple personality, an extreme version of what we all experience. I don't know. I think moving through context and saying, this is the role I'm playing now for the success of this story because it brings some goodness or some positivity to the world is not a disorder. But it's an interesting thing to think about. Here's a great big quote from Herbert Fingarette. You can read it on your... Herbert Fingarette wrote the best book I've ever read on Confucius. I love that book. It was only like 95 pages, too. It's so weird how like sometimes really great books are not very long and not very detailed, but they really impact. Herbert Fingarette, I'll never forget. Book about Confucius. It was really cool. It's like so tiny and short. I read it when I was at the University of Pittsburgh. When I was a graduate student there. Stories are not abstractions from life, but how we engage with it. We make stories, and those stories make us human. We awaken into stories as we awaken into language, which is there before and after us. So language is there before you're born. It's going to be there after you die. The question is not so much what do I learn from stories as what stories do I want to live? What stories do I want to perpetuate and push and make people tell and retell and live their lives in harmony with, in concert with, or be inspired by? That's why we speak to each other, not to communicate facts or the truth about a situation. It's the story that inspires you to be a better person that you want told by other people because it'll make a better world for everyone. That's the power of storytelling. And so far as I'm non-dual with my narratives, the question is just as much, what stories want to come to life through me? What is the story I'm going to live my life by, and what's the one that I want others to live their life by? We don't see things as they are, we see them as we are. That's a cool quote. The mind needs stories as much as the body needs food. You guys read a bunch of trash, don't you? You watch bad YouTube videos about celebrities. We have to get these stories about why. Why are they doing that? Why are we doing that? This Laura Sims quote is very cool about Sioux First people, called the Sioux, Native American people. Why do they tell these stories? To become human beings. Not everyone makes it. The stories show us, and this is like the power of literature and why it's important for young people to read, is because literature shows us how to be sympathetic and how to identify with different kinds of people. That's why the government of Florida right now is banning so many books in the classroom, because they understand the power of stories. They understand the power of stories to unmake a story that benefits a particular political orientation. Not Republican, but a particular kind of economic exchange that benefits certain people over others. Something to pay very careful attention to is censorship. If everything is a story, why would I need to censor a story? Why wouldn't I just tell a story in contradiction to that? It's lazy, and it also betrays the fact that they do know that stories are powerful, and they just have no answer. So you're just not permitted to encounter that, because it might make you more sympathetic or imagine there's other ways to live than to be working for a wage for some boss you'll never meet somewhere, which is a pretty powerful narrative. But people are like, but I have a really nice truck and I can make my truck payment. Is that liberty? Is that freedom? Is that the story we want? Good questions. Meaning is improvised together. I kind of like that line. That's kind of cool. What does that mean? We're making it up as we go. What it means, we're making it up as we go together. It's kind of wild to think about. Okay, let's move on here. I'm not going to go through every single line, but just kind of talk about some of the things that I think are super interesting. If the self is made, you probably think, oh, this other stuff is interesting. Why don't you, I know what you could do. Do you know what you can do, kids? You could post the interesting quotes you find on Discord. That would be great. I'd love that. If you think I've missed it or messed up, critique this video in the comments or go to Discord and do it. Oh, students. Now, if you're watching this and you're not part of one of my classes, sorry, you don't have access to the Discord. You're just like somebody from the public wandering around. Sorry, bro. You're just going to have to leave a YouTube comment. But I'll still engage you because, that's the story I want to live by. I like discourse. I like talking. I love arguments. I think it's great. And there's a bunch of people out there who do not carefully read my work, and they think I'm against debate. but those people, we have a word for those people. Stupid or illiterate. They can pick. Either you can't read my works, you don't understand it, or you're not smart enough to understand what I'm saying. So those are your two choices. That's probably for another video. If the self is made of stories, they are not a function of the self, but vice versa. What does that mean? The function of the self, they are not a function of the self, they are a function of the story. Huh? The self is a function of the story? Okay. So my self comes out of the stories that I tell? So who's telling those stories? If I don't exist until the stories are articulated, where am I? Do stories make us human in order to reproduce themselves? Northup Frye, Dan from Discord, will love this part if he's watching, said that a poet is a myth's way of making another myth. According to Hugh Piper, Western culture has been the Bible's way of making more Bibles. Is civilization the way stories evolve? The Bible's way of making more Bibles. So we're making more moral tales the same way. More verses to quote, more things to say. I guess the world is kind of like that. There's lots of verses people quote all the time. Very possible. All right, I think we're going to stop here with the Susan Sontag quote in this video, and then the next video will pick it right up in video number 2, The World of Stories, David Loy, video number 2. And that's going to be it. What do you think about this book? I think it's super cool, super interesting. 3 more videos to come as we think about it. But for now, good night, goodbye, good morning, good afternoon, and good luck and Godspeed to all of you. Yes, this has been a video produced by me, Dr. Steve Yano, St. John's University. It has nothing to do with this. This is all me, but these are from my classes I teach at St. John's. Please leave a comment if you want to know more. See you in the next video. Bye-bye. Bye.